of the most exciting areas of developmental biology, a new science called evolutionary developmental biology, sometimes called EVO-DEVO. EVO-DEVO is the science that studies the developmental mechanisms of evolution. It looks at the proximate causes, the material causes of evolutionary change. As Thomas Huxley, one of Darwin's friends, first tried to point out, evolution needs a theory of the arrival of the fittest as well as a theory of the survival of the fittest. To make new evolutionary changes, one has to change the development of the organism. When we say that the common horse of today has but one toe, but that it came from an ancestor with 5 toes, what we're saying is that changes in the placement of the cartilage cells of the limb caused a new phenotype to come into existence. So I want to talk about the preconditions for evolutionary developmental biology. First, why is there a need for evolutionary developmental biology? And second, what discoveries had to be made in order for evolutionary developmental biology to come into existence? Usually when we discuss evolutionary biology, we talk about the mechanisms of descent with modification. In other words, the mechanisms of natural selection. There are 5 basic principles of natural selection. First, there's variation within a population. Secondly, there's competition for survival, with most of the organisms not being able to raise offspring in the great and complex battle of life. The third principle is the survival of those organisms most fit for their environment. And the fourth principle is that the offspring for the next generation come from the survivors. Starting in the 1920s, when genetics was able to be added to evolutionary biology, a 5th principle was added, namely that the offspring inherit the genes that made their parents most fit for the environment. In the past 150 years, biology has shown all these principles to be correct. First, there is variation within the population. There is enormous variation within the human population. Just think of your classmates. Second, death is critically important, and most organisms die before reproducing. Darwin figured out some of the possibilities if animals were to reproduce without death pairing their numbers, so that an aphid, for instance, can make 524 times 10 to the 9th individuals in a year. A housefly could make 2 times 10 to the 20th individuals in a hot summer. And Staphylococcus aureus, the bacteria, could cover the entire planet 2 meters deep in 48 hours. So death is critically important. Moreover, death can be selective. In a study done on the Galapagos finches during the drought of 1976 to 1977, the grant showed that those finches that survived were those that had the largest beaks. They were able to get food resources that were unavailable to those finches with small beaks. So death was selective. Also, the notion that survivors inherit the genes that made their parents fit has been shown throughout the animal kingdom, not only in Darwin's finches, but also, for instance, in mosquitoes. The mosquito has amplified its esterase gene over 200 times, allowing it to degrade the insecticides that had been used to kill it. Similarly, the housefly and the cotton budworm have mutations that also give them resistance against insecticides. Humans have been evolving, and malaria has been one of the strongest agents in causing human evolution. For instance, changes in human blood types, changes in human blood proteins, and changes in human blood groups have each conferred resistance against malaria. And of course, we know that bacteria get resistance to drugs like penicillin, streptomycin, or indeed a whole host of antibiotics that have been used to kill them. So yes, survivors have offspring that inherit the genes that made their parents fit. But as you could see, mosquitoes that get immune to pesticides still are only mosquitoes. Humans that get immune to malaria are malarial-resistant humans. We haven't evolved new types of organisms this way. To get new types of organisms, Thomas Huxley suggested you needed to change development. You needed a theory not only of the survival of the fittest, but of the arrival of the fittest. You needed a way to look at changes in development. So he said in 1893, evolution is not speculation but a fact, and it takes place by epigenesis. Epigenesis is the technical term for development. He couldn't say development because development could also mean evolution at that time. But it takes place by body construction changes. But in 1890s, we did not have a theory of body construction. That had to wait until the later part of the 20th century. Starting in the 1970s, people such as Susumu Ono, Alan Wilson, Mary Claire King, and Francois Jacob reformulated evolution to be changes in regulatory gene expression during embryogenesis. That changes during development were what constituted the important mechanisms of evolution. In their paper in 1975, Mary Claire King and Alan Wilson looked at evolution at two levels in humans and chimpanzees. And they sequenced proteins and found very little difference between the protein amino acids between chimpanzees and humans. And they state small differences in the time of activation or in the level of activity of a single gene could in principle influence considerably the systems controlling embryonic development. The organismal differences between chimpanzees and humans would then result chiefly from genetic changes in a few regulatory systems, while amino acid substitutions in general would rarely be a key factor in major adaptive shifts. So there were two levels of evolution, one at the protein level and one at where that protein, when that protein, how much that protein was going to be expressed. This resulted in what was called the incompleteness argument, or the argument from incompleteness of natural selection. One example of this is in a paper by Hughes and Kaufman in 2002 concerning the modification of arthropods. They say, to answer this question of arthropod adaptation by invoking natural selection is correct, but insufficient. The fangs of a centipede and the claws of a lobster accord these organisms a fitness advantage. However, the crux of the mystery is this: from what developmental genetic changes did these novelties arise in the first place? How did you get arrival of the fittest? Now, Richard Goldschmidt was one of the first people who was thinking of trying to link evolution, development, and genetics. And he was the person who really said that evolution consists of inherited changes of development. And you might want to look at this way. There's functional biology, which is anatomy and gene expression. You take the first derivative of functional biology, dx dt, and what you get is development. Development is the first derivative of functional biology. If you take the second derivative of functional biology, namely the derivative of development, what you get is evolution. So there's functional biology, development is changes in functional biology over time, and evolution is change of development over time. So evolution can be looked at as consisting of inherited changes of development, and developmental variations can bias which changes are more probable than others. Moreover, a more comprehensive theory of evolution is formed when the population genetic model of evolutionary change is supplemented by a developmental genetic model of body construction. In the 1980s and 1990s, some of the rules for body construction began to become apparent. First principle that was discovered by developmental biologists was that there is a small toolbox of regulatory genes that control the development of the embryo. There is remarkable similarity of these developmental regulatory genes throughout the animal kingdom. These genes encode paracrine factors and transcription factors, and they are linked by signal transduction cascades. The second principle that was discovered by developmental biologists was that there's enhancer modularity, that the expression of a gene can be altered in one organ without changing its expression in other organs was critical for evolutionary developmental biology, because one of the critiques of evolutionary biology was that if you mutate the gene in one cell, it'll be mutated in all the cells. So how could you get hereditary changes which will lead to evolution? What we now know is that there is enhancer modularity. The third principle discovered by developmental geneticists was that there's gene duplication, and this can allow genes to acquire new functions and new expression patterns. So looking at the small toolbox, one of the best examples of this is the specification of the eye. The Drosophila eye is a compound eye that's made from imaginal discs that develop within the larva. The human or the mouse eye is not a compound eye. It's a one-lens eye, and it's made by interactions between the brain and the epidermis. Two very different types of eye, but both types of eyes are specified by the same gene, namely PAX6. The PAX genes and their relatives specify eye development throughout the animal kingdom. What's really amazing is you could take an activated PAX6 gene from a mouse, put it into the regions of Drosophila that are going to form the jaw, and what will happen is the PAX6 gene will specify the jaw region to become Drosophila eye, even if this PAX6 gene were from a mouse. Numerous regulatory genes that specify particular organs have been found to be homologous throughout the animal kingdom. So that's the first principle, the small toolbox. There's a relatively small group of genes that control development throughout the entire animal kingdom. The second principle is enhancer modularity. Here, a particular structural gene contains many enhancers. The enhancers allow it to be expressed, say, in the limb, or in the heart, or in the brain. If you mutate one of these enhancers, say the heart, the gene can still be expressed in, say, the limb and the brain. So by mutating and forming new enhancers, one can express the genes in different subsets of organs. This has been shown to be very important, for instance, in the evolution of stickleback fish. Stickleback fish can be found in marine environments where they have a pelvic spine, which is the equivalent of a hind limb, or they can be found in terrestrial environments, in lakes, where they do not have these pelvic spines. One of the genes that's important in making the pelvic spine is a gene called PITX1. PITX1 is found in the hind limb of vertebrates, and it's found in the pelvic spine region of the stickleback fish. In the lake forms of the stickleback fish, the enhancer for the ventral spine has been mutated, where the other enhancers are functioning. So PITX1 can still be expressed in the thymus, in the neuromast cells, in the olfactory pit of the nose. It can still be made in those organs, but in the lake-dwelling fish, it's not made in the pelvic area. Now, the pelvic spines of the marine fish allow those fish to avoid predators because the spines will lacerate the predators, destroy their jaws, where the predators in the lakes will actually grasp the pelvic spines in order to better eat the fish. So natural selection can work on not having the pelvic spines. But how do you get this condition of not having pelvic spines? You can delete an enhancer. That happens in humans. Humans have deleted the enhancer of the Duffy blood group substance in regions of the world where falciparum malaria is prevalent. The protist that causes falciparum malaria actually uses the Duffy blood group substance to gain entrance into the red blood cell where it can reproduce. The Duffy blood group substance is also found on certain neurons. By mutating the enhancer so that it cannot bind a transcription factor, allows the Duffy blood group substance to be absent on the red blood cells, but still present on the neurons which use it. By modulating enhancers, you can get evolutionary change. You can get selectable variation. Selectable variation can also be achieved by gene duplication. There's globin genes throughout our body. Now, there used to be an ancestral globin gene. That gene duplicated. Some of those globin genes acquired new functions. Some of the globin genes became the myoglobins, which are used to acquire oxygen in the muscles. Another group became the hemoglobins, which acquire oxygen in red blood cells. The globin genes that are involved in hemoglobin have also duplicated several times to form the alpha and beta, gamma, epsilon, and delta families of globin genes. Gene duplication may be very important for human brain evolution. One of the things that distinguishes human brains from the brains of most mammals is that human brains keep on developing. We keep our rate of very rapid neural growth. Most animals suppress that rate of neural growth. Now, there's a gene called SRGAP2, and it's found in all mammals. But in humans, that gene has been duplicated twice. Now, SRGAP2 encodes a protein that actually slows down neural growth. Now, that gene is still active in humans, but one of the copies, SRGAP2C, is a copy which has mutated. It's been changed so that it actually inhibits the other SRGAP2 proteins. So with SRGAP2C being active, it inhibits the inhibitor of neural growth, and it's one of the genes that allows the continuation of neural growth in the human brain. So here we have the three principles that allowed evolutionary developmental biology. The principle of the small toolkit, the principle of enhancer modularity, and the principle of variation through gene duplication. We are now going to look at the developmental mechanisms that can produce large anatomical variations. We will be using those three principles of evo-devo, the small toolbox, enhancer modularity, and gene duplication, to look at the mechanisms by which changes in gene expression can give rise to anatomical variations. What we find is evidence for what Francois Jacob called evolutionary tinkering. Nature rarely makes new genes, but repurposes existing ones. Fortunately, as Wallace Arthur has pointed out, there are only four major ways that this tinkering can take place. The first way is to change the place of gene expression. This is sometimes called heterotopy. In other words, the cells that express the gene can be different between species. The second way is to change the time of gene expression. This is sometimes called heterochrony. The third mechanism is changing the amount of gene expression, heterometry. And the fourth mechanism is to change the kind of gene being expressed, to actually change the protein sequence. This is called heterotypy. Now, heterotopy, changing the cell types that express the gene, can explain, for instance, how the duck got its webbed feet. Most land-dwelling vertebrates start off with webbed feet in the embryo. Our limb bud is webbed, but as you can see, the chick hind limb has freestanding digits like ours. The duck hind limb has webbed feet. During development, there is cell death in the webbing of the chicken limb, just like in our limbs. And that's shown by the red dots on the chicken webbing. However, the duck has very little cell death in its webbing. The cell death is caused by signals from paracrine factors called BMPs. And the BMPs here are expressed in both the chick and in the duck hind limb webbing. So what's the difference? The difference turns out to be whether or not inhibitors of BMPs are made in the webbing of the limbs. In the duck hind limb, the gene for gremlin is being expressed, and gremlin inhibits BMPs so that the BMPs are not allowed to signal for cell death in the duck hind limb. In the chick hind limb, gremlin and other inhibitors of BMPs are not being made. Those genes are not being expressed, and so BMP is free to cause the cell death in the webbing. You can show this experimentally. You can take a bead and coat it with a salt solution, a saline solution, and put that in the webbing of a chick embryo. The webbing is not saved, the BMPs destroy the webbing, and you get freestanding digits. However, if you coat the bead with gremlin protein, such that gremlin protein is dispatched throughout the webbing, what happens is you get a duct-like region of the limb, such that the webbing is retained. This is also seen in the bat wing. So here the forelimb keeps its webbing. The bat limb is an extension of the fingers of the bat and the retention of the webbing between the fingers. All mammalian embryos start off with webbed forelimbs, but the bat is somehow able to keep the webbing there. And you only want the webbing in the forelimbs of the bat, not in the hind limbs of the bat. The hind limbs of the bat are free digits such that it can perch. What happens is a BMP protein, BMP7, signals the cells to die in the webbing of the bat hind limb and the bat forelimb. But the bat forelimb webbing expresses the genes for gremlin and FGF8, two factors that inhibit BMP signaling and thereby allow the webbing to be retained in the forelimb of the bat, but not in the hind limb. Heterotopies, changes in the cells expressing certain genes, are very important in making evolutionary change. One of the new structures formed by heterotopy is the turtle shell. The carapace of the turtle is formed by ribs that go into the back dermis. Now, most ribs go ventrally, forming a rib cage meeting at the sternum, but not in the turtle. Unlike any other animal, the turtle's ribs migrate laterally and they actually enter the dorsal dermis. It's believed that this migration into the dorsal dermis is occasioned by the expression of FGF10 in certain cells of the dermis. FGF10 attracts the rib precursors into the dermis, and that's where they form their rib, not ventrally, but laterally. Once they are in the dermis, they then can signal to the skin to form the rest of the bony plate of the carapace of the turtle shell. So what makes a turtle a turtle? Its ribs. Why do the ribs go in a new direction? They are attracted there by a paracrine factor that normally is not expressed in the dorsal dermis. So heterotopies, changes in the place of gene expression, is a very important mechanism to getting evolutionary novel structures. Another way of doing this is heterochrony. For instance, how does the dolphin get its flipper? Well, FGF8, which we just mentioned as an inhibitor of BMPs, also functions as a mitogen. It functions to keep cells in a state of proliferation. Normally, after a certain period of time, the FGF8 gene is turned off and limb development stops. However, in the dolphin, FGF8 signaling is retained. The gene for FGF8 remains active, and as a result, you get these long fingers, which are characteristic of the dolphin flipper. Changing the timing of gene expression is also seen in the formation of snake ribs. Some snakes can have up to 300, sometimes even 500 ribs. How do they get so many ribs? They actually shorten the time it needs to make each rib from each somite. And as a result, you get a large number of ribs made at any given time. One of the most important heterochronies might be human brain growth. The human brain keeps growing at the fetal rate for over 2 years. In other words, we're still making new neurons. In other mammals, including other primates such as the chimpanzees, they do not develop their brain continuing the fetal growth rate. That's something that humans do. And what one finds is that there are numerous genes that appear to be active in allowing humans to keep a rapid rate of neuronal growth after birth. Many of these genes are inhibitors of inhibitors. For instance, the GAD45G gene. This encodes a protein that is an inhibitor of neural growth. Humans have lost the neural specific enhancer for this gene, thereby allowing this gene to be expressed in other organs, but not in the human brain. Humans also, as mentioned earlier, have an imperfect duplication of the SRGAP2 gene, such that one of the duplicates actually encodes an inhibitor of the original gene. The original SRGAP2 gene encodes an inhibitor of neural growth, and the copy, the imperfect copy, actually inhibits that inhibitor. And here we see a very important principle of developmental biology. Activation is often the inhibition of an inhibitor. Now, heterometry, the changing the amount of gene expression. This has been seen to be critically important in the evolution of those finches that Darwin observed. There are broad-beaked finches and there are finches with narrow beaks. Those finches with broad beaks have an embryo with a craniofacial region that expresses large amounts of BMP4. Now, BMP4 we saw earlier was involved in cell death, but in the facial region, BMP4 activates mitosis. And this is another principle of developmental biology. What a protein does depends on the region of the embryo where it is being expressed. So BMP in the webbing of the limb causes cell death. BMP in the craniofacial mesenchyme causes cell proliferation. This is what it does in Darwin's finches. The more BMP4 that's being expressed, the broader the beak. This can also be seen experimentally. You could take active BMP4 genes and add them to the beak primordium of embryonic chicks. And what does it do? It actually broadens their beaks by causing more cell division. So that's heterometry. So the next way that you could get anatomical change during development is heterotypy, changing the identity of the gene being expressed. This actually can help us explain why insects only have 6 legs. Most arthropods have a lot more. If you think about a seafood platter with lobsters and shrimp and crab, they have lots of legs. Spiders have lots of legs. Millipedes and centipedes are known for having lots of legs. Why do insects only have 6 legs? In the group that became insects, there was a mutation in a gene called ultrabithorax. Ultrabithorax acquired new amino acids in the protein, and these amino acids were able to repress the distalis gene from being active. Distalis is a gene that activates other genes that help form the limb. If it is repressed, the limb doesn't form. Ultrabithorax, which is active in the insect abdomen, is able to inhibit distalis, and as such, the abdominal limbs of the insect fail to properly form. So, there are 4 ways of tinkering to get large anatomical variations. There's heterotopy, changing the place of gene expression. Heterochrony, changing the time of gene expression. Heterometry, changing the amount of gene expression. And heterotypy, changing the identity of the gene being expressed. Gavin de Beer, writing in 1953 in a book called Embryos and Ancestors, said, "But since phylogeny, that is evolution, is but the result of modified ontogeny, development, there is the possibility of a causal analytic study of present evolution in an experimental study of the variability in genetics of ontogenetic processes. Finally," he said, "it may be possible that freed from the trammels and fetters which have so long confined thought, the whole of the animal kingdom may appear in a new light, more homogeneous and compact than had been imagined, and with the gaps between its major groups less formidable and perhaps even bridgeable. Evolutionary developmental biology is making those gaps less formidable and is building the bridges that unite them."